Well, welcome everyone to our Beyond the Hype, exploring the evolution and applications of generative AI. We're very excited today to talk with Corey Patton. He's the CEO and works at Pramana, who has been a real leader in the natural language space around data. So, Corey, welcome. Welcome to Domopalooza. It's so great to have you here.
Oh man, my first Domo Palooza. This is great, Chris. Looking forward to this conversation.
This is special. This is special. Well, I'll tell you what, let's jump right into it because AI has really jumped back into the mainstream after kind of being a little bit dormant there for a while. Before we get into ChatGPT and some of the applications, I thought it might be helpful to just kind of talk a little bit about how you see, maybe that the history of natural language AI in particular, but just sort of AI in general. I thought it'd be good to talk about how we kind of got here and where we see this going.
Yeah, Chris, I really think going back and figuring out where the groundings of all this came from is important when you figure out where we are, where we're going. Are we in the beginning? Are we in the middle? Are we in the end? Have we achieved what we're looking for? But I think you have to go back all the way to 1966. So picture this, all right? 1966, MIT, Dr. Weizenbaum. And he's created a program that simulates kind of a human computer interaction. But what he's done is he has created the first chatbot, really the first chatbot that a human can interact with a computer and get a prompt and then keep that interaction going. But he's created it using a bit of a trick. And he's done some interesting stuff on the back end, but a therapist. So he's describing and ascribing weights to a sentence when a person interacts with it. And then the computer will then turn that sentence around, ask another question, and it's done some pattern matching. And then the human kind of feels like the computer is actually talking to them. So for instance, if the computer program and prompt would say something like, "How are you today? What would you like to discuss?" And then the interaction goes, user says, "Well, I'm depressed." Then Eliza, which was the name of this program that he created, would come around and say, "Do you enjoy being depressed?" And of course you don't. So the human would say, "Well, no, I don't." And Eliza would then say, "Well, why not?" And so there's not a lot of intelligence going on. It's just turning this around, keeping the user engaged, and then having follow-up questions go on and on and on. But it really actually convinced a lot of people at that age, at that time, that there was something smart and intelligent going on with language. And so it created what we consider as the first human computer interaction of a very rudimentary form. But things have changed vastly since then.
Yeah, I remember that. It's funny when you brought up the term Eliza because I was like, wow, that is going deep. That's a deep cut right there, going way back into the archives. And I think if there's one thing about Eliza that seems to echo to today, I think you've alluded to, which is, we kind of or use AI in some ways when it starts getting smarter to sort of mimic or become a mirror to our own understanding and behavior. And I think that's one of the things that, at least for me, and probably if I'm guessing right, what sort of attracted a lot of people to sort of the current chat GPT is that it is somewhat of a mirror held up to how we think. And but it's also a bit of an illusion, right? Because you mentioned Eliza was sort of a trick. It found a pattern, and that pattern was good enough for us to think that it was thinking. Um, how do you see GPT and some of the other sort of large language models? And maybe we should explain a little bit what a large language model is, but where are the similarities and where is it different? Is this another sort of, hype cycle that we're going through where I think anyone who's followed AI for the last few decades, I mean, you don't even have to do few decades, just the last few years, we have these hype cycles. And in AI in particular, their hype cycle, the low points have been called the AI winter. And we've gone through several AI winters where the promise just never played out.
Yeah, well, I actually think this might be a little different because I think these large language models are they're changing the game just in the conversation. And I think it's just everywhere. And it's no coincidence that it has exploded in this hype cycle when everybody has more access to information. There is more information on the internet available to everyone for these large language models to tap into. There's more memory and processing power than there ever has been before for these large language models to actually function and work. And so I think they're going to be a bit of a tool that's going to be around for a long, long time. And the one thing that I think that I would say is they're going to unlock new access points for people to ask questions of data and get information. But there's going to be some downfalls to it as well. So got to be careful about that. So I would say we could spend a lot of time talking about that, though.
Yeah. So interesting thing that you brought up there, and this is our beyond the hype session. So I think it's important to kind of go a few layers deep to help people understand what's the same, what's different, and also what are some of the kind of underlying ideas and principles that have all of a sudden made this technology kind of leapfrog in a way. I think at least in the public sphere, and I think one in particular is you mentioned how it's being trained or it's using lots of information, lots of compute, if I'm sort of paraphrasing you
Yeah.
correctly. And I think that's one of the things that's hard to predict about AI in general, at least deep learning. AI is made up of several different sort of categories. AI is sort of our general um, category of machines that seem to do human-like tasks. Then there's machine learning, and under that, there's deep learning. I think here we're talking about deep learning. And one of the things that's fascinating about deep learning to me has always been that if done right, the more compute, the more content that you put to the problem, it's hard to see where it sort of maxes out, like where its performance will max out. Whereas many other more simple models, even like the earlier natural language models, like, and we're getting a little technical here, but like, recurrent neural networks or Markov chains, where it was really just give me a word and then give me the probability that then another word will follow. Those kind of tapped out fairly early. They became somewhat, they would give you some somewhat nonsensical answers.
Mhm.
Uh, Maybe we should talk a little bit about like what's changed with GPT. Like why now? We're throwing a lot of compute, we're throwing a lot of content at it, but we're also throwing a slightly different way of processing this information and finding patterns.
Oh,
Do you have any insights into that?
well, I mean, we can go back down to the rabbit hole and go down to the transformer level if you want, which is exactly what all this is based on. And it uses something called attention and self attention. And we could go all the way down and talk about that. But I think at the top layer, it just know that it looks at the context of each sentence as well. So it's not just that token, one token, next token. It's a bit of a contextual based approach to what is next and going to happen in that sentence and then how it will be written. And I think some of that stuff is really what is that mirror you referred to earlier. As beautiful as the response looks, the more we're going to believe it. Because humans can look at something that sounds robotic or seems robotic or looks robotic and think, oh, a computer wrote that. The more you put into language that looks and sounds like somebody else wrote it, the more we'll believe and trust, which can be a fallacy because it doesn't actually mean that nicely written text is always accurate and quite the opposite sometimes.
Yeah, well, you talked about the rabbit hole there, and I'd like to just dip in there just a little bit
Sure.
because it's interesting to see things like GPT, which have actually been around for several years. And now my neighbors are talking about Chat GPT. I'm not sure anyone even knows what GPT stands for. And, it's generative pre-trained transformer. So it's that transformer model you talked about. And what is really interesting about that is, to your point, instead of it just saying, well, I'm going to guess the next word based on just the word that came before it, which is very simplistic. It does have this attention, which allows it to do several things. One, it provides, I think, and this is one of the dangers, very convincing prose, right? Like very convincing um, text. Can write historical articles with, or to your point, you do a lot of work with sports teams and agencies, and it can provide some very persuasive and convincing sounding statistics that are completely wrong. So
Absolutely.
the idea that it actually has intelligence, sort of what researchers would call general intelligence, we're pretty far off from that. It's going to take maybe a lot more work there, but it definitely with these new models can be trained much faster.
Mm-hmm.
They can provide much greater convincing sort of text. And I think also, and this is the part that we've definitely been exploring, is they can also be fine-tuned, right? You can sort of tweak the models in some ways, but we're still not exactly sure because I think when you're looking at other AI, anyone who's done a lot of data science work is used to looking at the scoring of a model, right? Like we train a model and a bunch of data, and then we can track how accurate it is. This is a little different though, right? Because this is a broader sort of machine, and I'm not sure exactly like how. people or companies could use this and say, yeah, I have a lot of confidence in this model that it's not going to, what sometimes people call hallucinate, right? It's not going to give me a completely weird answer. And I was wondering if, as you've looked at natural language query systems, what are some of the challenges and techniques that folks might need to think about in terms of, actually trying to begin to leverage some of this
Yeah,
information,
that's
this
a great question.
technology?
It's a great question because especially when it pertains to LLMs, yeah, they're an incredible way to get language out of a system, but at some point at its base, it has to reference calculation and it doesn't compute. Okay, the LLMs and that ChatGPT just don't do computations right now. And if you're going to be an enterprise level client, you're going to need something that calculates some sort of mathematical score or streak or consecutive pieces of information, and it just doesn't do that. So you're going to have a problem there right off the bat. But I think one of the differences is if you ask ChatGPT the same question 10 times, you'll get 10 different answers. And that's a probabilistic system. I think for when you look at a business use case, it might be fine for writing 10 different poems, but if you're going to try to figure out a business use case, you got to put a framework around those probabilistic answers so that you don't get a different a profit margin score each time you ask that question. So I think what is actually really impactful and important is working with LLMs. So traditional natural language techniques, creating a framework around the large language models that it makes sure that something that is started out as probabilistic becomes very deterministic each time the user interacts with the system in a very conversational natural language way. And that's what we have built our entire technology on at Pramana. So that is our conversational selling point and value prop, is to allow you to ask the question that way and get a determinative answer out. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I was going to say. So in a way, what you're trying to do is actually kind of build in a bit more safety, I guess, into the model, right? So
Mm-hmm.
LLMs, large language models, probabilistic, meaning for the layperson, it's like random. You will get random sort of generation, and whether that's a language model or maybe using, some of these new sort of transformer models for images, they're all based on just random noise, and then it molds that into something that looks recognizable through its architecture.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, especially in business, I mean, this idea of having a deterministic output, having something that is reliable and correct and repeatable is important.
Yep.
Um, I think one of the things that's actually kind of fascinating also is that we haven't quite touched on this, but we've all been part of it. We've all been testing this. This has all been one giant experiment all of a sudden, right? Like, uh, you know, ChatGPT has been sort of lauded as one of the fastest growing sort of experiments out there, right? In 5 days, I think they said they got about 1 million people. And that was the end of November, right? That was like
Mm-hmm.
the start of December. And now we're at the end of March. It's kind of remarkable. Um, During this experiment, people that you've been talking to, either, customers or technologists, is there certain things that they've been asking or seeing that is worth talking about, right? Is there fear behind some of this? Is there excitement? Is there both?
Oh.
I think you kind of mentioned before that, if I were to paraphrase, this kind of opens up a kind of a minefield of potential opportunities and problems, right? From misinformation onward.
Well, look, I think it's great that people are talking about language in business. I
Mm,
think it's great that people are talking about communicating with a system in the way that almost every single person can communicate with a business intelligence tool or a platform
mm,
with, visualizations and graphs and intelligence. You have to be able to get information out as quickly as you can think of the question. And I
yeah.
think I think what language has tried to do over the course of many, many hype cycles is create that natural human computer interaction that makes everybody an engineer, that allows everybody to get an answer to a question that they don't have to interpret from a visualization or a chart or a spreadsheet that's been sent to them, and gives everybody access at the speed of thought, if you will. And when you end up with a large language model where everybody can now ask ChatGPT their own questions about anything in life, people start to say, oh gosh, this is awesome. This is amazing. But yet you have to think a little bit at the end of the day that that model was trained off of everything on the internet, good, bad, Facebook posts, Twitter, misinformation, and it's going to come back in the same way that it went in that you're going to have predictions and context in the form of beautifully written or potentially misleading output. So I think what people are doing right now that is really impressive is they're saying, okay, where else can we interject large language models? And I think from the coding community, the Chris that you see every day, to be able to have ChatGPT produce code of a rudimentary level that might just need a little bit of tweaking, low code, no code platform stuff with ChatGPT to help that. You know, having logs monitored and ChatGPT being able to ask questions about things like that in the engineering standpoint. I think it's useful across all areas of business to some extent, as long as it have framework around it. And I think people understand that there are potentially pitfalls that they can fall into with it, just using it on its face.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that's part of the sort of experiment, and this is not super unusual in the world of tech, where our tech begins to advance far greater than our understanding of the implications of it, the first order and second order implications of it. You kind of touched on this. I'd like to kind of drill down on it a little bit more if I could, which is, um, why is language so critical? Like, why is it so attractive? I mean, I think you're seeing this in real time, where they took, in the case of OpenAI, they took the GPT model, they trained it as to be an expert essentially to create this chat GPT. Obviously, I think there's a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes there. To your point, you said it doesn't do math. I'm sure they're working on that, right? But they also, these models get better because they get feedback, right? People are able to say like, yeah, this is the answer I was kind of expecting, a thumb up, thumb down. But in general, why is language a good way of kind of navigating or interfacing with machines?
It's the only way that everybody can use. It's the only
Yeah,
natural interface that needs no training. It's the only way that people have
that's interesting.
been associating with questions on the internet for years through Google. It's the only way that people feel comfortable enough to not have to interpret something that's put in front of them because they can just ask the question and get that answer. And I think it's the only way to create a true self service. This is an intelligence model for workers, for the enterprise, and for people at home.
Yeah.
Language to me really, I always go back to a couple of things. One, when I started working in the sports world years and years ago at CNN Sports Illustrated, we had a guy that had the stats almanacs. And all he did
Hmm.
was look up stats information for us when you wanted him to, want it one by one by one. But he didn't scale. His name was Quags. And he looked at books in the corner and he'd get you an answer to your stats question you wanted, potentially sometimes by broadcast, and sometimes there were just too many questions for him. And I thought, what if we could create that type of model at scale where you could create a million different quags where people could ask their own questions in natural language and get those answers out instantly. And that was the model that we built Pramana on years ago, is to provide an instant access to not just sports, but to all businesses where you could just ask the question in conversational language. We'd do the hard part of converting it to an answer that was determinative and get that output instantly. So I've always looked at him
Yeah.
as kind of, that was a way where I saw business could only scale if everybody could interact with data in a way that was natural to them and they didn't have to do a bunch of interpretations or know any sort of a SQL code.
Yeah, I think that's kind of fascinating because I think there's two things to that. I think from a user experience standpoint, looking at language and linguistics, sort of the structure of language, there's a few things that kind of pop up. One, it does seem very easy, but also two, from a tool making standpoint, you know, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people have Alexas out
Yeah.
there, and my family still uses Alexa to like listen to a song or set a timer. There's probably a million other things it can do, but when you don't know what you can ask something,
Mm-hmm.
even though you have the language, that's a problem. So I think one of the challenges is going to be, well, how do we prompt people, right? Like how do you have a conversation? How do you create the AI that doesn't just give you a response, but helps sort of move the conversation forward? And even though it may branch, that's absolutely fine. But human beings don't know what to ask, right? Like it's almost like being paired up with like the worst person at a party, right? You're just like the conversation is going nowhere, and you're stuck with that person, and you're like, that's. I'm sure we're going to get there, but that seems kind of one of the big challenges. I think the other thing that's also kind of fascinating and in some ways a little depressing, at least for me, is when you see these large language models actually put out really convincing and persuasive text that's also completely wrong. It makes me wonder, like, am I also kind of like that predictable? Am I that machine as well? I think, but I think in some ways, that's a kind of an existential quandary that we'll all have to kind of deal with in the coming years and months and years. But
That'll be our next session. Yeah.
yeah, that'll be our next session. Yeah, we'll do a little AI therapy session
Yeah.
later. But I mean, I think in part that's going back to sort of the early pioneers of the digital age, Claude Shannon, who did a lot of work. Well, he did the bit. A lot of people don't know that that was an invention, but his early theories around information, the sort of mathematical models for information theory, came from language, came from trying to see, if I remove letters of words, can people still recognize the word? If I remove words from a sentence, and that's essentially what we've built, right? We've built super technical versions of that problem, and I think it sort of is both kind of insightful in that we're looking at ourselves and the way we communicate in different ways. Some of what we do is very probabilistic,
Oh
right?
yeah.
But there are also some random parts, and done right, that random part is really what we mean by intelligence, right? Is kind of surprising people and leading people in certain ways. So I think one of the things I'm interested in is how these tools, once we maybe learn a little bit more about them, and I think right now, it used to be a technology problem. Now it's kind of an imagination problem, right? We're trying to, where can we apply these things? And I think there was that quote about Steve Jobs where he said, the PC is going to be like the bicycle for your mind. I think the question is going to be, well, what's AI? Like, is it a supercar for the brain? I don't think we know yet, but have you seen any, I don't know, sort of glimmers of inspiration around, how humans and AI ideally could augment, right? Or is it too early to
I
tell?
think it's a little too early to tell on this one, only
Hmm.
because the hype cycle is so. I think it's still on the uphill with LLMs. I really do, because I think that
Yeah.
ChatGPT is first out of the gate for most people to recognize and have public mind share about. I think when you look at why people are so excited about ChatGPT,
Hmm.
is because it's endless. It is a
Yeah.
dialogue that has no end to it. When you talk to some of your friends, this friend knows about sports, this person knows about business, this one's a lawyer,
Hmm.
so you can ask law. You have all that. ChatGPT seems to be that friend that knows everything to everybody. And so you can ask it
Hmm.
whatever you want. You can get an answer about whatever you want. It can write a song, a poem. You feel like, man, this is a really interesting communication mechanism. And it's kind of seems super too good to be believed. And in some ways it is.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
for the layman, when they see this and they interact with it, man, it's a special looking tool. I think we're just beginning to see where people are going to start to apply it. But again, I will caution there will need to be frameworks around it for it to be actually applicable across most industries.
Yeah. I mean, we kind of talked about, some of the potential minefields and
Mm-hmm.
opportunities. So for example, right now we're constantly carrying around our phones, and so we're offloading a lot of our
Yeah,
memory, our intelligence already.
yeah,
I think trying to figure out how artificial intelligence can augment, and I think it's great when we start by sort of automating the menial so we can move on to the meaningful. But I wonder, with this technology advancing so quickly, might we skip some steps, and this potential has the potential to be used for lots of different applications and some not so great. But we'll focus on the positive
mhm,
parts of it. What
yeah,
what are some of the ways that, if you were running a business,
hmm,
I mean, you are running a
yeah.
business, but let's say you're running a business of that's not necessarily focused on AI all the time. What are some of the strategies? Either is there homework to be done, or is there inventory of ideas or content that, if it's thought of in the right way, you could begin taking advantage of some of these technology, at least experimenting? Because it sounds like what you're saying is, if the hype cycle is kind of oscillating back and forth so quickly, it'd be really hard to kind of invest a lot in anything, because we're not really sure where that's going to be. That could change quite dramatically in just a few months. But what are some of the strategies people might want to be thinking about in terms of augmenting how they do work with data in particular?
Yeah, I think for a long time, when you looked at what was possible with data and what was possible with production, was
Mm.
the bandwidth of the people that you had working for you and their time,
Hmm.
effort,
Hmm.
energies, their report cycle, who they could get information from if they were stuck, who they could get an answer from if they needed it to do more in-depth analysis, executives who really didn't know how to get answers out of information, out of data sets, and couldn't get instant answers when they needed it to make critical real-time decisions. This type of interaction point, I think the preparation for the business is, what is it that we could do if we could take every one of our employees and turn them into a decision maker, turn them into a
Yeah.
distributed machine of intelligence where they could actually make their own decisions because they knew how to interact and access information and take an action. I think we now live in and work in such, home, work at home, disparate,
Yeah.
environments that there's just no walk across the office and say, hey, run the report on this from the last 2 weeks and get that answer back in 10 minutes. Now it's all emails and file sharing. And if you can
Yeah.
allow people to engage and access data in a quick, natural language way that they feel comfortable with, you're going to change the momentum for people inside the business because they're going to have hundreds of people that actually can take decisions and make actions because they can access and analyze data through a natural language interface that they would not be possible if they didn't have that comfortable adoption method.
Yeah, I think for me at least, as we've been talking to some customers and kind of experimenting ourselves, it seems like there's certain strengths that these large language models have. One is they can create pretty convincing
Yeah, of
text.
course.
Two, if you can fine tune them through what we call prompts, meaning you have an input like here's a question I want to ask, and here's a kind of an expected output, and so the model can kind of adjust. That's great. It seems like they're naturally very good at summarizing
Hmm.
content.
Hmm.
So that's a use that we've we've definitely played with quite a bit, which is a great menial task, right? Like I was talking to some developers earlier today, and they spend a lot of time at the end of a week just going through either Jira tickets or um, code updates that they've made, and they have to summarize all of those. So they've started doing that. Or I think you made this mention earlier, programmers using it. I don't know if you used unit test, but it was unit test, which is kind of important. We should, developers should do those things, but it's usually the stuff that doesn't really get done because it's not as fun and it's kind of hard. Um, I've seen developers just buy their own subscription to like a GitHub Copilot or something like that just to write code. So generating code, even like SQL queries, right, on your data seems actually pretty good. It may not be perfect, but it seems to really lower the bar for, especially, maybe for someone like myself who's maybe not so technical with SQL. I at least don't have to start with a blank page. I can start with something. Um, so
Yeah,
it seems,
we have that we have that in development in the way that we're working. Our
yeah,
tool is to get the user quickly up and running. There is a large language model interface that will allow folks to get that quick SQL in, look at it, verify it, and then make that deterministic output be real based on a natural language query that outputs that executes that SQL. I mean, that is a really cool way to go
and
from the blank state to a
yeah,
verified output that can be accessed by just asking a conversational question.
yeah, I think that's really important. Again, from a user experience standpoint, one of the most daunting things you can present somebody, a customer, would be here's a blank
Yeah,
interface,
yeah,
right? You figure out what to ask it.
yeah.
And maybe I know we touched on this a little bit, but maybe it's worth talking about again because I think, with other models, they don't really depend on feedback. But if you're, prompting the model,
Hmm.
giving it the data, giving an expected sort of response, you need the feedback, don't you, from the people consuming
This is
this,
how
and they have to be somewhat knowledgeable or become part of the feedback process.
human in the loop stuff is never going to go away fully. You still need some
Mm,
human in the loop to make sure that what you're doing is has the context that you expect. Again, ChatGPT is not intelligent. It looks great, but it's not intelligent. Humans have
yeah,
so much contextual information and knowledge that they bring to every interaction with a computer, to a system, that we're not there yet. We're just not there on
yeah.
that part yet. So you just need them in the loop to make decisions and actually trust a system. And I think that thumbs up, thumbs down is kind of essential in a lot of systems.
Yeah, I think that's something you're going to see a lot, which is, especially early days, people are going to have to be vigilant.
Yeah,
Mistakes will be made, I'm sure.
absolutely.
But yeah, I think the first thing I was worried about was, is this just going to be Clippy 2.0? Is it just going to be the bane of my existence, giving me constant, very official sounding, you know, feedback all the time when I don't want it? I hope not. I don't think it will. I think to your point, we're in a different stage for sure.
Yeah.
I think, you know, the issues that will many organizations are going to have to grapple with again are around what do humans do really well and what can the machines do well? How do we, you know, distribute the workload and augment the work experience
Yeah.
to get things done
Yeah.
in a smarter way?
And I think they're very good at what you said earlier when you said creating summaries of output data. So you have an
Mm,
output of a set of data, and ChatGPT is great at being pointed at that and writing a narrative, prose, human sounding sentence or paragraph about that data. And that is something that can take
yeah.
humans lots of extra time that could be probably pretty well subsidized by a large language model in the mix.
Yeah. It's interesting that out of the box, I know we sort of touched on this at the start, talking about the architecture, but out of the box, these models are really good at doing that
Yeah.
because of that attention mechanism you were talking about. Like they are able to sort of create broader context rather than just sort of, bag of words type
Yeah.
responses.
And I think but the key to that is with an output of data. And something has to create that
Yes.
output of
Yes.
data that
Yeah.
it won't do with the question that's being asked. So
That's
I
right.
think that's a really cool differentiation piece you got to look at is you are great at creating summaries of data once provided the data. And so that's definitely something you got
That's
to keep
right.
in
That's right.
mind.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's work that has to be done there for sure.
Hmm.
For sure.
Hmm.
Okay. So I mean, a lot of excitement around this,
Hmm.
and you've made sort of a note of caution. I think this is where we're collectively learning as we're going along,
Hmm.
um, and I think that I'm curious to see how this is going to um, kind of impact my day to day because I think for a while I was kind of seeing AI as kind of getting boring,
Yeah.
honestly. It's just becoming part of everything, right? It's Siri is going off all the time. I'm getting recommendations in stores or on Instagram or Snapchat. That's constant. These are huge, huge AI models that have been running and kind of driving our behavior, and we lean on now for entertainment,
Hmm. We do.
right? Like,
Yep.
it's your YouTube recommendations. It's helping me, get to my kid's soccer game on time because I'm being rerouted around traffic. So I feel like, it's already become a important or essential part of like how we navigate a day. Um, are there any surprises you think that might be coming around the corner? Or is this just a new form of AI that will soon become integrated in how we do work or how we entertain or inform
Yeah,
or get
I think it's the latter. I don't know. Again, we don't know what's coming around the corner surprise wise. That somebody's working on some skunk works that we haven't seen before because that always happens. That'll always come around. But I just do think this will start to be folded into a lot of the things that you use and integrate every day. If you look at how many companies and applications that have sprung up around the idea of generative AI and even ChatGPT and OpenAI's stuff, where they said, okay, if it can do that, what if we put some framework around it again and created this specific application for X? Whether it's medical records, whether it's law reviews, whether it's any of those types of things that they look at and say, if we point this correctly, we can change the game in the way that people can ask questions of X. I think you'll see that just it'll become standard. It'll become part of most everything that we interact with will have a natural language component. I just think that's really it's going to create this curiosity that people will want to interact more and more in a way that seems natural to them. And I think it'll come at some point. Can you imagine, pulling up a browser and not having the ability to Google something? Once it's set there, you get used to it. There's no going back to it. And I think some of these will change the game. We just have to be careful on how we get to where this becomes ubiquitous across all products.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very hopeful and important note to end on, which is, ultimately we we build our tools, we shape those, and they shape us. So we want to be careful how we shape those tools, right?
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
and yeah. Well, I can tell you, I think if there were one other point that I'd like to sort of summarize, I think for our audience here is, if you are thinking about this, there are certain strengths that these large language models have. And, right out of the box, they're very easy to kind of leverage, but there are some caveats, Corey, as you had talked about.
Mhm.
There are also some opportunities, I think, to begin experimenting in really interesting ways and do things that just a few months ago would have been impossible. I mean, the things that you can do today are really kind of surprising, almost kind of becoming kind of boring maybe, which is pretty crazy. It reminds me of like the earlier days, when AI was being used for image
Mhm.
recognition.
Mhm.
Was this a cat, a dog, a pig, a hot dog, or whatever? That was a hard problem to solve. Now it's trivial. And so I think, now it's going to be, how do we start unlocking, new value from our data in smart, replicatable, reliable kinds of ways? I can say, at least speak for on the Domo side of things, there are certain things that no matter what kind of models you'll be using, there's a certain level of complexity, things that have to be done. With data, it has to be in the right kind of place, in the right kind of form. There's security, right? Like you don't necessarily want to be sending your private data to models all over the planet. Um, and then, of course, working with great partners like Pramana. So I'm very excited. Is there anything that you'd like to sort of leave us with,
Mhm.
that either um, with a little bit of excitement or hope or next steps?
Yeah, I'm excited because something that myself and my team have spent years and years being
Mm,
obsessed with is the interaction with natural language has now become front and center for everybody. But
yeah,
for excuse the quote, but trust but verify. That's really
yeah,
ultimately
yeah,
what
yeah.
we have to do here, and that is the core basis of everything that we do at Pramana in our application and our natural language tool. That is a plug and play natural language tool, natural language query tool that sits directly on your Domo data, and you can ask natural language questions. But it's going to give you validated, accurate, 100% trustworthy output every single time you ask that question. And I think imagine the first time you ask a question with a GPT system that isn't tested fully, and it gives you the incorrect information, and you take that up to your boss, and they say, "Well, where did you get this?" "Oh, I got it through our ChatGPT integration, and it's wrong." People won't trust it, and it won't be adopted. So trust but verify. These tools will make life in some ways easier, and in some ways very challenging because they can mimic correct information because of the way they're written.
Yeah, very convincingly. I think that's a great way to kind of wrap this up, which is, get out there, experiment, play, but be careful. There's going to be a lot of opportunities to do great things and also do some very unexpected things, which may not be that great. So, Corey, I want to thank you and thank everyone for joining us for sort of a peek behind the curtain of generative AI and its application. And I hope everyone's enjoying Domopalooza. And Corey, thanks for your time today.
Awesome. Had a great time. Thanks, Chris.